Korea falls. From 1910 until 1945, Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. The victorious World War II allies agreed that Korea should be made an independent country, but until negotiations could take place, the US took charge of the area south of the 38th parallel, while the Soviets occupied the northern half. Plans to establish a unified Korean government failed, and in 1948, rival governments were established, the communist government of Kim Il-sung in the north, and the pro-Western government under Syngman Rhee in the south. An officers' training school, and a small arms plant was set up by the United States. They gave the country $100 million worth of military hardware to arm the 96,000 soldiers of the South Korean Armed Forces. On July 17, 1949, Owen Lattimore said, "The thing to do is let South Korea fall, but not to let it look as if we pushed it." In a memo to the State Department, he wrote, "The United States should disembarrass itself as quickly as possible from its entanglements in South Korea." In 1949, the American troops were withdrawn from South Korea, and in a January 12, 1950 speech, U.S. Secretary of State, Dean G. Acheson publicly stated that South Korea was outside of the U.S. defense perimeter. The North Koreans, heavily equipped by the Russians, considered Acheson's statement an invitation to attack, in order to unify the country under communism. General Douglas MacArthur had received military intelligence reports from General Charles A. Willoughby that North Korea was preparing for an invasion, and John Foster Dulles of the State Department went to investigate, and covered up the activity he viewed at the 38th parallel. On June 24, 1950, the North Koreans swarmed across the 38th parallel, and proceeded to overrun the country. Rhee appealed to the United States, and the United Nations for help, as the communists closed in on the South Korean capital of Seoul. Truman called for an immediate meeting of the United Nations Security Council, who convened the next day, and called the attack a breach of the peace, ordering the North Koreans to withdraw to the border. 2 days later, the Security Council called upon the UN members to furnish assistance. Immediately the US sent in ground troops and began airstrikes. On July 7, the Security Council urged 15 of the countries to put their troops at the disposal of the United States, under the UN command of General Douglas MacArthur. With the UN being involved in the war, all U.S. battle plans had to be submitted for approval, in advance, to the Under-Secretary for Political and Security Council Affairs. Due to a secret agreement made by Secretary of State Edward Stettinius in 1945, this position was to always be filled by a communist from an Eastern European country. During the war, it was filled by Russia's General Konstantin Zinchenko. It was later revealed that Russian military advisors were actually directing the North Korean war effort, and one of those advisors, Lieutenant General Alexander Vasilyev, actually gave the order to attack. Vasilyev was the chairman of the UN Military Staff Committee, who along with the Under-Secretary for Political and Security Council Affairs, was responsible for all UN military action. Vasilyev had to take a leave of absence from his position, to command the communist troops. So, what it boiled down to, was that the communists were controlling both sides of the war, and Russia was able to receive vital information concerning all troop movements within the UN forces in Korea, which was passed on to the North Koreans and Chinese. General MacArthur realized what was happening and planned one of the most daring military assaults in the history of modern warfare. To execute the engagement, he handpicked a group of trusted and loyal officers so the initial stages would be kept a secret. MacArthur did not submit the strategy to General Zinchenko. The resulting amphibious assault on September 15, 1950, at Incheon Bay, turned the tide of the war by enabling UN forces to recapture Seoul, destroyed large supply dumps, and began to push the North Koreans back across the border. In October, they captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang, and many communists retreated into Manchuria and Russia. The Taiwan government was planning to move against China, and Truman warned Chiang Kai-shek not to make an attempt to recapture his homeland. Truman ordered the American 7th Fleet into the Strait of Formosa to prevent any type of invasion. This freed the Red China Army to enter the Korean War. The Chinese, with the excuse that they were protecting the security of their country, stormed across the border on November 26, 1950, and stopped the UN Army at the Yalu River. Chiang then offered to send an advance force of 33,000 troops into North Korea, but the State Department refused. They were a member of the UN, yet the United States would not let them fight. The Korean War, Korean conflict, or police action, as it is sometimes called, developed into a stalemate of broken ceasefire agreements, and MacArthur made plans for a massive retaliation against China. He wanted to bomb the ammunition and fuel dumps, the supply bases, and communication lines to China, bridges across the Yalu River, and to post a blockade around the Chinese coast. However, on December 5, 1950, Truman and other administration officials decided that this sort of action would bring Russia into the conflict, and possibly initiate World War III. MacArthur was ordered not to proceed with any of his plans. The Joint Chiefs of Staff said, We felt the action urged by General MacArthur would hazard the safety of the U.S., without promising any certain proportionate gain. A letter written to a congressman, by MacArthur, was read on the floor of the House, giving them the full story of how much the Red Chinese were involved. Still, nothing was done. General Lin Piao, the Red Chinese commander, said later, "I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur from taking adequate retaliatory measures against my lines of supply and communication." With MacArthur insisting that there was no substitute for victory and that the war against communism would be either won or lost in Korea, he was relieved of his command, on April 11, 1951, by General Matthew B. Ridgway, a member of the CFR. Air Force Commander, General George Stratemeyer said, "We had sufficient air bombardment, fighters, reconnaissance so that I could have taken out all those supplies, those airdromes on the other side of the Yalu. I could have bombed the devils between there and Mukden, stopped the railroad operating, and the people of China that were fighting could not have been supplied. But we weren't permitted to do it. As a result, a lot of American blood was spilled over there in Korea." General Stratemeyer testified before the Congress, "You get in war to win it. You do not get in war to stand still and lose it, and we were required to lose it. We were not permitted to win." General Matt Clark told them, "I was not allowed to bomb the numerous bridges across the Yalu River over which the enemy constantly poured his trucks, and his munitions, and his killers." MacArthur would later write, "I was worried by a series of directives from Washington which were greatly decreasing the potential of my Air Force. First, I was forbidden hot pursuit of enemy planes that attacked our own. Manchuria and Siberia were sanctuaries of inviolate protection for all enemy forces and for all enemy purposes, no matter what depredations or assaults might come from there. Then I was denied the right to bomb the hydroelectric plants along the Yalu River. This order was broadened to include every plant in North Korea which was capable of furnishing electric power to Manchuria and Siberia. Most incomprehensible of all was the refusal to let me bomb the important supply center at Rason, which was not in Manchuria or Siberia, but many miles from the border, where the Soviet Union forwarded supplies from Vladivostok for the North Korean army. I felt that step by step my weapons were being taken away from me. That there was some leak in intelligence was evident to everyone. Brig. General Walton Walker continually complained to me that operations were known to the enemy in advance through sources in Washington. Information must have been relayed to them assuring that the Yalu River bridges would continue to enjoy sanctuary and that their bases would be left intact. They knew they could swarm down across the Yalu River without having to worry about bombers hitting their Manchurian supply lines. I realized for the first time that I had actually been denied the use of my full military power to safeguard the lives of my soldiers and the safety of my army." General Douglas MacArthur also said, "I am concerned for the security of our great nation, not so much because of any threat from without, but because of the insidious forces working from within." Over 33,000 American lives were lost in a war that they were not allowed to win. Instead, a truce was signed on July 27, 1953. However, the communists weren't giving up on Korea. With North Korea being supported by China, Russia and the Eastern Europe Communist bloc countries, they built up their military strength, and made enormous economic gains. During the late 1960s, they began a dialogue for the reunification of Korea, and bilateral talks were held in 1972, which further improved their relations, as the communists attempted to take over with diplomacy. A non-aggression pact was signed in December 1991, and in 2000 a summit meeting was held to explore the possibility of a reconciliation. As information about communist agents occupying high cabinet posts surfaced, the American people took out their frustrations at the polls. Eisenhower's slogan was, "Let's clean up the mess in Washington." He had promised peace with honor in Korea. However, the truce allowed 400 soldiers to remain in communist prisons. Even though the 1952 Republican platform called the Truman Plan ignominious bartering with our enemies, in reality, Eisenhower's plan made even more concessions. Eisenhower's tough rhetoric on communism ushered in a renewed patriotism in America. People behind the Iron Curtain were inspired, and in the fall of 1956, Hungarian freedom fighters forced the Russians to leave their homeland, ending Soviet occupation. So what did the United States do? According to the Congressional Record of August 31, 1960, the U.S. State Department sent the Soviet Union a telegram which read, "The government of the United States does not look with favor upon governments unfriendly to the Soviet Union on the borders of the Soviet Union." Hours after receiving the telegram on November 4, 1956, Khrushchev sent Russian troops back into Hungary to retake the country. Soon Eisenhower initiated foreign aid programs to the communist governments in Poland and Yugoslavia, who by 1961 received almost $3 billion in food, industrial machinery, jets, and other military equipment. In June 1956, John Foster Dulles said that if the U.S. discontinued their aid to Marshal Tito, Yugoslavia would be driven into the Soviet fold. However, 2 weeks before, Tito said, "In peace as in war, Yugoslavia must march shoulder to shoulder with the Soviet Union." On September 17, Tito announced his full support of the Soviet foreign policy. Meanwhile, U.S. aid continued, even after 1961, when Yugoslavia began their own foreign aid programs to spread communism among the world's underdeveloped nations. When Eisenhower's 2 terms came to an end, the amount of economic and military aid to communist and neutralist countries came to $7 billion. In the February 25, 1961 edition of People's World, and the March 10, 1961 issue of Time, Robert Welch, founder of the anti-communist John Birch Society, charged that the Eisenhower administration was a tool of the communists.